Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen wrapped up her 4-day trip to China on July 9th. While the exact agenda items she discussed with Chinese officials were not disclosed, it's safe to say that her number one urgency was to test the waters on China's appetite for purchasing US government debt. Despite the very public and increasingly tense economic competition between the US and China in recent years, Secretary Yellen has repeatedly emphasized in her public remarks that the goal for her trip was to establish and deepen relationships, and that the United States is not seeking to decouple from China. Secretary Yellen's careful wording and posturing have been criticized for seemingly too agreeable to China. But Secretary Yellen, an accomplished economist and a savvy negotiator, had good reasons to speak and act the way she did. Against the backdrop of a soaring budget deficit, persisting high inflation, and the rapid selling of US Treasuries from large foreign investors such as Japan, the US is facing an upcoming financial tsunami that has the potential to become one of the greatest financial crises ever. As such, Secretary Yellen has been calling for a better relationship with China, as China may be the only one who can help. Why is this the case? Let's explore. This is 21st Century Report. We bring you global news and analysis for you to succeed in the 21st century. As the US Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen's number one task is to ensure that there is sufficient money to cover the federal government's expenses. However, the US economy is stagnant, while its mandatory expenses have skyrocketed, causing a large and growing national deficit that needs to be funded by issuing an ever-increasing amount of debt. In the year 2000, the US government debt was just $3.5 trillion, which was about 35% of the GDP. By 2023, the debt has ballooned almost 10 times to $32.5 trillion, and is equal to 124% of GDP. Even worse, the soaring US debt shows no sign of slowing down due to a structural mismatch between a stagnant revenue and rapidly growing expenses, which cannot be reduced. Chief among the expense factors that drove America's budget deficits are: Number 1, healthcare. 475% increase projected in 30 years. And number 2, Social Security. 140% increase projected. Both increases are necessary for the aging population. Indeed, within 30 years, it is projected that 1/5 of the adult population in the US will be 65 or older, and the associated healthcare and the Social Security benefits simply cannot be reduced. Number 3, debt interest payments, which are expected to increase 314% to a stunning $5.4 trillion in 30 years. As a share of the economy, total interest on the national debt will become the largest expense over the next few decades, surpassing national defense spending in 2029 and the Social Security in 2050. Number 4, war and military spending. All the projections so far are assuming that the US defense budget will stay fairly flat at about 2.6% of the projected GDP. This assumption is highly unrealistic, considering America's history of frequent warfares in different parts of the world every year for the past 30 years. According to the Watson Institute at Brown University, the cost of US wars from 2001 to 2022 was a whopping $8 trillion. Without a question, any new wars or military spending will drastically add to America's already serious deficit situation. Given the reality of America's demographic trends and the spending needs, the unquestionable reality is that the US government must borrow large sums of money on a continual basis to finance its rapidly growing money gap. In June 2023, A major news topic in the US was that the government could be forced to default on its debt if the US Congress would not allow the government to borrow more money beyond a preset maximum borrowing limit of $31.4 billion, which is the so-called debt ceiling. As the deficit has already exceeded the ceiling, not be able to borrow more funds to cover the money gap would lead to the government not be able to pay all of its bills, including the lack of money to make interest payments and thereby trigger a debt default. Secretary Yellen warned that a failure to meet the government's obligation would cause irreparable harm to the US economy, the livelihoods of all Americans, and global financial stability. President Biden had to fight hard to convince the world that the nation has never defaulted on its debt and it never will. Ultimately, the Congress allowed the government to borrow additional money for now to pay its bills and thereby averting a default till January 2015. However, the conversation on the possibility of a default by the US government did not go unnoticed by the international financial community, and the fact that US debt quickly rose from 31.4 to over 32.5 trillion in just 6 months did not help either. It is widely believed that the US will need to raise at least an additional 1 trillion debt in 2023, which adds a lot of pressure on Secretary Yellen as she must find willing buyers of the large and increasing US government debt, i.e. the US Treasuries. So who are the buyers of the US Treasuries? By July 2023, the US national gross debt had exceeded 32.5 trillion. Of that amount, about 49% are owned by the US government or government-affiliated entities. Specifically, 21% or about 7 trillion are held by US federal government, 22% by the Federal Reserve, and 6% by state and local governments. About 30% are held by domestic non-government investors such as mutual funds and insurance companies. The rest 21% are held by foreign nations and entities. So collectively, the federal government and its affiliates accounted for about half of all purchases of the US debt. It might seem odd that the US government can sell debt and pay itself money to buy back any unsold portion. But this funny accounting is accepted as long as the US government is still regarded a high-quality borrower with the ability to pay back all of its financial obligations. However, that confidence in the US government as a default-free borrower has been shaken recently. As the US debt soared to record levels in recent years and with no sign of stopping, the ability for America to cover all of its debt obligations had been an area of hot debate for the international financial community. The concern that the United States could default on its debt has been a major factor for foreign investors to reduce their US Treasury holdings, including Japan, historically America's most reliable debt supporter. If there isn't enough foreign buyers of US Treasuries, the US government must rely on more domestic buying of the debt, i.e. requiring domestic businesses and the government entities to buy US Treasuries. It should be noted that the US government has already had to rely on more domestic buyers for its debt due to a lack of sufficient foreign buyers. The Federal Reserve in particular has had to shouldering most of the added debt burden. The big problem is that an over-reliance of domestic buyer of debt could create havoc on the US economy. For one, if too much internal funds are used to purchase US debt, then there will be a shortage of money supply left for government spending and for business growth. For two, at some point, the government will need to print more money to meet internal needs, which may lead to issues like inflation, high interest rates, and currency devaluation. These issues could necessitate the need to print even more money, thereby creating a vicious cycle and a perfect storm for market crash and a financial depression. Clearly, To meet the needs for America's growing money problem, it is a must to have strong and stable foreign buyers. As foreign buying would allow America's business growth, while avoiding the need to print money, thereby mitigating the danger of inflation. Historically, 30 to 35% US debt are purchased by foreign governments. However, as mentioned previously, foreign investors have been reducing their holdings of the US Treasury. At the end of 2022, foreign investors held just 21% of US debt. This is even lower than the 25% foreign ownership during the 2008 financial crisis period. Is there any possibility for the foreign investors to step up and buy more US Treasuries? Among the foreign economies, only a handful has sufficient economic capacity to make sufficient purchase of US debt. The table here shows the top 10 foreign buyers plus the rest of the G7 nations. Further look at the top 10 foreign investors show that 6 of the top 10 nations are international financial centers. These 6 countries, as shaded in gray in the chart, UK, Belgium, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Cayman Islands, and Ireland, act as financial conduits for outside entities, and as such, these 6 nations have very little control themselves on how much US Treasuries will be purchased. These financial centers cannot be relied upon as a stable source of borrowing, as there can be large and unpredictable fluctuations in its capacity to buy and hold US debt. An example of such volatility can be seen here for Belgium. Among the other top 4 nations, 3, Japan, Canada, and Taiwan, are mature economies with fairly flat economic growth outlook and a limited capacity for making additional US debt purchases. So the only other nation left on the chart is China. And China fits all the criteria the US needs as a stable source of debt purchasing. The size and the stability of China's economy created the capacity to absorb a significant chunk of US debt. Indeed, China is not only the most viable option due to its economic stability and scale, it is the only option. This is particularly the case since Japan has been unloading its treasuries in recent years despite urges from the US to buy even more. It should be noted that China in turn would also benefit from buying more treasuries, since holding more US Treasury would offer a natural vehicle for China to park its excess cash and preserve the value of its trade surpluses. In fact, China had been the largest US debt buyer in the world, holding over 1.3 trillion. However, China was forced to de-risk itself from the US and reduce its US Treasury holdings in recent years in response to a series of economic sanctions levied by the US government. As a reference point, Russia, the number 8 economy in the world, sold off its US debt holdings in 2018 in response to US sanctions. With China's economy and the US Treasury holdings both 10 times the size of Russia, losing China as a US Treasury buyer would be a very undesirable outcome for the US, particularly as other large US debt holding nations, including Japan, do not have the ability to increase their US Treasury purchasing. In addition, it should be noted that Hong Kong, as the world's number 12 holder of US debt, and losing China likely will also mean losing Hong Kong's sizable holding of US Treasury. Again, this is a very undesirable outcome, one that the Secretary Yellen does not want to see. With no other sources of increase in foreign funding, the consequence of over-relying on internal debt purchasing could be very serious for the US financial system. If America must rely more and more on domestic purchasing of its own debt, this will lead to issues such as high inflation and interest rate and slowed business growth. We are already seeing some of these problems. Over the longer term, it will greatly increase the risk of a hard landing as well as a higher probability for the US government to default on its debt obligations and plunge the nation into a depression. Conclusion: the US fiscal deficit has ballooned to unprecedented levels, which necessitates heavy borrowing to ensuring the continued functioning of government operations and interest repayments. Domestic borrowing is not sustainable in the long run given the magnitude of the deficit. The need for stable long-term funding implies a need to tap into international lenders. Despite the ongoing economic competitions, China is arguably the only viable nation with the economic capacity to absorb the increasing US debt. It is also in China's best interest to maintain a financially strong United States. The economic relationship between the US and China, while complex, is overall highly complementary and mutually beneficial. It is unfortunate that the two nations have entered into an environment of distrust and potentially dangerous posturing. The world's problem demands a collaborative approach, and a partnering of the world's two largest economies is critical in paving the way for a safer and a more prosperous world for all of us. Thank you for watching this video to the end. If you like this video, please provide your encouragement by hitting that like bell and subscribe to this brand new channel. We would love to hear what you think about our channel, so go ahead and send us your thought via the comment box below. Our goal is to bring you global news and analysis that you can benefit from. We need your encouragement to keep us going. Thank you again. We hope to see you very soon. Until then, take care of yourself and each other.